Today I'm going to introduce you to a literary theory known as the theory of literary intentionality. And we're going to relate that to a short story by Flannery O'Connor called A Good Man is Hard to Find. Now, to do this assignment, you have to perform what I call a cold reading. If you think about it, when you read anything, pick up a book at Barnes & Noble, or even at the library, you might be attracted to the cover of the book. That information may make you want to read it. It might be by an author whose work you've read before. You might turn the book over and look at what critics have said on the back of the book. You might even open up the book to see how big the print is. You might look to see how many pages are in the book. When the book was published, what's the date? Is it a recent book? Is it an old book? So most of us, before we ever begin reading anything, short story book or a poem, we probably have some sort of information about that text, which will allow us, even in the slightest way, to prejudge it. A cold reading asks you to have none of that information. In a cold reading, you simply pick up a text, you start at the first word, and you end at the last word. And that's all you know about the text. Whereas typically, when you picked up a book or read a short story, it would have been assigned by a teacher, or you already had pre-knowledge about the author, or somebody recommended it to you, or maybe you've even seen the movie before you even read the text. So you have a lot of information that shapes how you read that text in the normal, real world. The theory that we're going to apply is called the theory of literary intentionality. And a couple of critics whose last names were Wimsatt and Beardsley, honestly I don't remember the first names, came up with this theory in the 1940s. And it was part of a movement known as New Criticism in literature that really mimicked what the French called a cri de texte, or really only writing about what the actual text says as opposed to what theorists or biographers or anybody else tell you about it. Essentially performing what I called earlier a cold reading. So Wimsatt and Beardsley came up with this idea that when we're searching for a meaning in a text, or learning how to understand a text, that what the author thinks the text is about is not important, is not necessary. Now, if you, and you all have, written something, not necessarily creatively, but mostly when we write, people ask us, okay, what is your essay about? What is your poem about? Why did you write that poem? As the author, we can say, pardon that, interrupted. As the author, we can say, well, when I wrote this, I was writing about X. I had this experience, it influenced me, or this happened to a friend of mine, or whatever inspired it. And as the author, you can usually say, well, this is what I intended finally to write. You may not know what that intention is when you begin writing it, but as you write through it, you figure it out. In very basic comp ret terms, this would be, your ability to express your thesis or something like that. But you intended to say something, and you use words to convey that intention, and you can say what it is. Well, authors, if you listen to them in interviews, they often can tell you, yeah, I wrote this book for X reason, or this is what inspired it. Or they may just say, I don't want to talk about that. But quite often we have access to their intentions. Unfortunately, when we find out that information, quite often it stands in for whatever other meaning we as readers who don't know the author's intention might come up with. Wimsatt and Beardsley don't want you to know any of that information. And they divide up evidence into primary evidence and secondary evidence. Primary evidence is basically the text itself. whatever you read when you read that text, whatever it means to you. Now, some of that will be based upon, for example, your knowledge of the form of a poem. You may know it's a sonnet, for example. Or you may understand the conventions of a short story, or the dramatic arcs of a play, and so on. You may have pre-existing knowledge of form in literature. That's okay, according to Wimsatt and Beardsley. If you know what iambic pentameter is and you're reading Milton's Paradise Lost, and you recognize that it's an iambic pentameter, that's okay. That's the primary information. But most of it is based simply on what you're reading. Now, the secondary evidence is what you're really supposed to ignore when you read. And that is any information you have about the author, so that you can interpret the story through their life, or history, or something like that. Any interviews with the author. You're not supposed to know anything about anything when you read, really, except the formal qualities of it. So I'm not going to tell you, for example, if Flannery O'Connor is a man or a woman. You can't tell from that writer's first name. I'm not going to tell you when that story was written. You're not supposed to find it out. Nothing about the story. You're not going to look up Flannery O'Connor and read a biography of him or her. You're not going to, if you're reading, let's say, the novel by Flannery O'Connor, Wiseblood, you're not going to go to the title page and see what year it was published in. So no information. None. And this will allow you to do a cold reading. And my basic advice for doing that is to open up the text, read the first line, and read until you reach the last line, and write down what you think it's about. And that's your reading of it. To do the assignment, we'll read the story first, cold reading, don't find out anything about the author or about the story. And then secondly, we will look at the author's stated intentions. The author did say what they thought the story was about. In other words, their intention. And you will be comparing what you thought the story was about to the author's stated intention. It's actually a lot of fun, and it will make you, after doing this exercise, you will become a much closer reader than you probably were before. Thanks.